Today, we'll talk about the upcoming industrial revolution in space, focusing specifically on manufacturing in low Earth orbit. We've previously talked about other manufacturing, using material from the Moon, Mars, or asteroids. We'll also talk about the failure of U.S. government regulatory agencies to keep up with the growing business of commercial space. This is risking U.S. leadership and innovation. This is actually just a quote from the head of one of the companies I'm going to talk about here. The next industrial revolution isn't on Earth. And what does that mean? Well, it basically means manufacturing in space. And in particular, here we're just going to focus on low Earth orbit manufacturing. And that's a little different than some of the other ones we've talked about in the past, where in this case, you launch the Earth materials, you manufacture something, you make crystals or drugs or whatever it is, you return it to Earth, and then the product is used on Earth. And for instance, you might have this miniature factory. This is an example of one from a company called Varda. Most of that picture is actually the photon bus from Rocket Lab. So that's one possible approach. This differs from In Situ Resource Utilization. We've talked about a lot about that in the past. For instance, Blue Origin has their proposal to make solar cells on the moon, where you use the lunar material to make it, and you use those solar cells on the moon, or maybe in orbit around the moon or around Earth for solar-powered satellites to transmit power back to Earth. Or other manufacturing and mining operations, for instance, mining ice, on the Mars or in the shaded areas of the moon, where with that you can make water, you can make air, in particular you can make propellant for the rockets. And so it's considered kind of going to be necessary that we do that for really expanding into space, because you need some way to get all that fuel, and it's just too expensive to bring it up from Earth. So, and we've talked about some of these companies before. Transastra and SpaceForge, in particular, are working on mining of asteroids. Now, one thing when we talk about manufacturing in low Earth orbit, we're not talking about assembling like cell phones or cars or something. You're really talking about making materials. That's what it's all about, is making materials, because you can typically, if you figure the right ones out, you can make ones that are much higher purity or much lower defects, like crystal defects and that kind of thing. And that's been proven in enough experiments already on the ISS, International Space Station. They've done a lot of tests on a whole variety of materials of actually making them in very small laboratory kind of quantities. And you think about it, that actually the International Space Station is officially the ISS National Labs. And they are a laboratory kind of organization. And they've been doing these experiments. And now these people are saying, well, let's take it a little further. Let's assume we can do this. And they have pretty good basis for saying they can at this point. What products specifically can we do this with? Which ones will actually make money? And how do we scale it up for wider use? Those are questions you don't answer in a lab. Those are questions you have to pretty much do think of the pilot plant stage, where you need a bigger scale to get started and then even bigger operations later on. So the companies involved in this heavily, there's Varda and SpaceForge are the two that are really doing the complete package of essentially manufacturing as a service. Then there's ones that have been in the business for a while, Redwire and Space Tango. They are thoroughly tied in with the International Space Station. Let's back up to why we want to manufacture in low Earth orbit. It comes down to quality, either high purity or lower defects, something you can do better in space than you can do here. So why is that even possible? Well, the first part is microgravity, low gravity. What actually happens to materials is quite different up there. For instance, any processes on Earth are affected by convection, by buoyancy, by sedimentation. There's all kinds of things that happen because of gravity that don't happen up there. And sometimes all those things, as they happen, they get in the way of making highly pure materials. So it gives you much more possibilities of making perfect crystals, for instance, or other complicated structures. Making of human organs, that's one that's been tested out to some extent. It's got a long way to go. They start out where they could do some 3D printing of a general scaffold kind of a structure at a very, very tiny level, but then they got to fill in with the cells. And the problem is keeping all that together. Well, you can do that when there's no gravity to pull it all down and just kind of, make it turn into a big blob on the ground. You can do that better in space. So there's a lot of hope. The key is just figuring out what are the things that we can make up there. Another way of looking at this is that different properties become important in space. For instance, surface tension totally dominates. If you've got water, and you tip the glass sideways, it falls to the ground. Well, if you do that in space, it just kind of hovers together, and actually surface tension holds it together. So it kind of gives you the idea that typically separation processes in particular are going to be quite different up there, and you may be able to exploit that. And again, that's what they hope to do. Okay, the second factor is vacuum. And that really has several implications. One is you just avoid a lot of contamination. On Earth,
Even, you have all these clean rooms in semiconductor manufacturing. Very, very hard to actually get all the particulates out of the air. And it's a lot easier up there. There just aren't that many. Or the air itself. If you have a chemical reaction with oxygen or nitrogen, things that are in the air, you can have chemical reactions. Those might interfere with what you're really trying to make. So that gives you an opportunity to do things differently. And of course, if you need low pressure, well, that's perfect. You can't get much lower than that. Some separation processes, again, you do that at very, very low pressure or low temperature, which is the third factor here. So for instance, a lot of cryogenic kind of stuff. When you have to use on Earth, where you're using liquid air and liquid helium or nitrogen, that's a whole lot easier to achieve up there. So there's reasons to believe that you can do a lot with manufacturing up there. Any process where crystallization is a factor, there's a pretty good chance you can do it better in space. One is the ability to separate them, but the main thing is you don't get the defects developing because you're not being pulled down by gravity. So semiconductors like gallium arsenide is an example of a semiconductor that probably could be produced in space. Now, a lot of the chips that are made, the equipment to do that is just so vast, you're not going to be making entire chips up there. However, it has been proposed to make the substrates. There's basically the lowest level of the semiconductors. They rely on high purity crystal materials of either silicon or gallium arsenide, these kind of things. And they think they can do that better in space. So crystals are a big place. Pharmaceuticals in general is a high value kind of a thing. And definitely it has been proven that some of them can be made there. Now, some of that is because they use crystallization as part of it. So one of the companies in particular is focusing on protein crystallization. And any drugs that they can make there, they think they can make better up in space. Other things that have been tried, fiber optic cable, and as I said before, human tissue and organs. So the key factor in all those is that they're high value, meaning the dollars per unit mass, is very, very high. And you need that because obviously it costs you a lot of money to get something up to space, do something with it, and bring it back down. So it better be, a small but very expensive product, and that's what they're looking for. Now, the place where some of these companies differ is space stations. Redwire and Space Tango, they kind of grew up in the International Space Station. Both of them, they've run a lot of experiments. Made in Space was a company that was actually bought by Redwire. So they've run all kinds of experiments in a whole variety of areas. But these newer companies, Varda and SpaceForge, they actually are going the other direction. They're saying ignore the space stations completely. What they're trying to do is provide a complete manufacturing and orbit service with reusable hardware. In other words, you tell them what you want, consistent with what they can produce. They take care of getting it up into space, running it, bringing it back down, and delivering it to you. And that's a lot different than the space station case, where you have to wait for a schedule, where there's somebody going up. Humans have to take it and carry it in. They have to hook these things up to the power and everything. And then the biggest drawback is probably down mass. You don't think about it too much, but we know how to get people up and back. Cargo, not so much. It's only the Cargo Dragon from SpaceX that even can bring anything back at this point. The space shuttle could, but everything else doesn't. And so you don't really have a lot of opportunities. You can bring back something on a Russian Soyuz craft if it fits in a briefcase. Yeah, and you're probably kind of crammed in there. Yeah, on their lap, pretty much. You do have a space in a Cargo Dragon, but they don't come back all that often. So you're kind of limited by a lot of things. The opportunity to bring things back, and then, of course, how much it'll cost. So the other thing is just basically they want fully automated processes. Once it takes off, there's just no human intervention required until it lands again. And it seems kind of ironic that here in NSS, we want to get people up into space and build civilization in space. But the reality is it's very expensive to put people in space. The way we're going to get there is by having as much automation as possible. There's almost just no way around that. And here's an example of building up an economy that is somewhat space-based, but it actually requires automation to do it. And anyway, the other thing is then they scale up. If you want to start manufacturing more, you just do more launches. And that's something where when you're in more of a laboratory environment like the International Space Station, you just can't really ramp up like that. So they're just saying, let's solve the problem. Look at it as a logistics problem. And let's solve the whole problem, getting stuff up and getting it back. We've already proven the processes can work. Now let's just scale it up. So it's industrialization. I would say they're focusing on industrialization, cost, scalability, and scheduling. And that's what their business models are exploiting. The main factor driving all this is everybody's still waiting for Starship from SpaceX. If it's another factor of 10 cheaper, at least, the economy changes. And it's just a question of, well, hurry up and get here and do it already. Everybody's kind of waiting on that. And this is another example. Everybody's just waiting on the assumption that things are going to get cheaper and cheaper for getting up into space. So taking a look first at SpaceForge, that's what the picture on the bottom of this shows. Some launcher got them up there. None of these companies make launchers. They assume they're using other people's stuff to get up there. That little satellite there, that's their product. It's a reusable satellite. You never really heard that term before, reusable satellite. Well, now you have. It's reusable. So it gets up there, it expands its solar cells, as shown in the bottom of that picture. Let's follow the rest of the life cycle. When it's done manufacturing inside that little cubicle, it has to fold the arrays back up. So it shows that on the left here, where you kind of start folding it back up. One thing they've done really uniquely is they're going to land. They have a huge heat shield, and there's no disposable tiles, there's no parachute, and no flotation device. And you say, well, how are they doing that? I mean, everybody like the space shuttle and all that, they all had to have tiles, a blade of materials, air friction, that essentially vaporize. What it is that they decided to go for a metallic object that's just really huge. You can't quite tell that in the middle picture here. But if you look at the recovery process, the little satellite on the right-hand side drawing here, that thing is really, really a small part of that. Recently, NASA has done some experiments with a heat shield that's been blown up. This thing just takes that much, much farther. It's some kind of woven metal cloth composite material. The big thing is it folds out like origami. It's so big and it has enough metal in it that it can radiate the heat away as it descends. And so they can just use it again. That's their hope anyway. Now they've tried this at small scale up to maybe 10 miles. They haven't actually gone beyond that. And of course that means they really haven't been able to test it at really high speed. But they think this will work. They're pretty confident. They call this thing Predwin. Apparently King Arthur had a magic shield. It's named after that. So anyway, they have some fairly unique and interesting technology. The recovery, it's shown on the right side of this, it may look like a bunch of drones that are kind of holding up a net, and that's pretty much what it is, I think. They're calling it a hover net. And I think what that means is they just took a bunch of drones and they send it out. They're doing a sea recovery, but maybe not too far out, and then they bring the thing back. And they're going to catch it in the net. That's also partially so that they won't do too much damage on landing. You know, they won't have a really, really hard bump. The net will slow things down. And they've tested this one also up to about 10 miles anyway. So interesting stuff. Now, they have had a setback, however. Their launch system to get them up there, unfortunately for them, was Virgin Orbit. They were flying out of that Cornwall spaceport in the UK. And that was the mission that failed. It wasn't SpaceForge's fault. This was Virgin Orbit. They failed. They lost that satellite. And then actually the whole company failed. In June of 23, Virgin Orbit failed. So they're out of the picture. That's too bad for them because a lot of their support probably came from the UK, but based around a core tenet of their spaceport, which is going to be Virgin Orbit. So they're working that out. Now, Varda's a little different, but it's doing essentially the same thing, except they're landing on land. 3 parts. They have the spacecraft bus, which in this case is actually the Photon from Rocket Lab. Once it gets up there, it provides propulsion, power, and so on. Then there's the reentry capsule, which you can see in the picture here, like in the middle. And that's a much more conventional one, not that different in size than the fairings you were using to get it up there in the first place. They land it with a parachute. If you look at this picture, so this is the capsule, which you see in the second part. The capsule is that conical shaped thing. That separates. The rest of this is all actually the Photon, what's essentially a small satellite from Rocket Lab. To get up there, they're flying up on a Falcon 9 transporter mission. They've already done it, the first one. So, but let's talk about the business model, first of all. Again, it's full logistics. Free-flying, self-sustaining, mass-produced, not relying on the space station. Simple ballistic entry, heat shields and parachutes. They're using more of the proven processes for this. They think it's cheaper to land on the land, faster than sea recovery. They're focusing on quick turnaround for reuse. Now, the key in both of these companies is focus on a simple process, one key process like crystallization, and do whatever you can with that. All the other stuff for manufacturing, you do that back on Earth. So you just get the high value part done in space, the rest on Earth. Their markets originally for Varda, pharmaceuticals for the most part, protein crystallization. Now there's a problem with that, and that's that for drugs, you got to have clinical tests, you got to have FDA approval. That takes years. So they need revenue along the way. So they pivoted, and what they're doing is they're now starting going on hypersonic testing. The U.S. is kind of behind in hypersonic missiles and technology in general. So it kind of works out pretty well. They're pivoting. Rocket Lab is doing the same thing. Basically, providing a test environment. They're a test environment because they're coming from orbit. So that means you're going at least 17,000 miles an hour. They figure they can test up to about Mach 25. You can test thermal protection, materials, sensors, all that kind of stuff. So they did their first orbital test. That went up in June for a 1-month mission. And actually, they finished in a couple weeks. So the manufacturing step was done on June 30th. It's still up there. Now, why is that? They expected to come down by parachute, but no, they're actually stuck. They don't have permission to land.
What?
Yeah, the FAA says, well, Varda, they launched their vehicle and they never got a re-entry license. And now, the thing is, there probably was no such thing as a re-entry license before because nobody ever wanted to. I mean, other than just as a byproduct, spent rocket stages and satellites at the end of life and that kind of thing. This is a whole new category. Space mining, space manufacturing. If you're going to bring stuff back to Earth, that's a whole different animal. And nobody's set up for that yet. But also, even the Air Force, they were going to land on the same place where the OSIRIS-REx asteroid return sample was. Apparently, the Air Force never actually gave them permission to do that. So the blame here is unclear. I mean, it's hard to believe Varda is completely free of blame in this. I mean, they surely had to realize they needed some of this. But there is a general problem in the government right now of timely approvals. In their case, the launch approval was probably done through SpaceX because SpaceX launched the transporter mission that launched, probably 50 or 60 different payloads. But SpaceX didn't care about where it comes down, so they wouldn't have gotten that. Maybe Varda just assumed that was included. Apparently it wasn't. So they're still negotiating how to get this thing back to Earth. But in the meantime, gearing up for their next one, they're negotiating landings in Australia as their next possibility. Now, by coincidence, this works out pretty well for them because the U.S. independently had just concluded an agreement with Australia that they can launch U.S. loads. I mean, you have to have an agreement for that because they're sensitive technology typically. If you're going to be a foreign country launching, you better have safeguards in place. And luckily they have that. This actually says that this company, if they have to, could be based out of Australia or still be based in the U.S., but launch out of Australia. There is a general problem here. The government just isn't keeping up. There is a lot more launches, a lot of commercial activity, and Varda was one example. The other big one is Starship, the holdups that have gone on for that. Nobody believed that SpaceX could get Starship put back together and ready to go for the next test as quickly as they did, but they've been sitting there for a couple months now. There's a problem. There's so many agencies that are involved in this. You got the FCC for communications. The Federal Aviation Administration is the big one right now. They control the airspace and the military as well, if it affects military bases. Some cases, the military has to approve things, especially if there's exports or other military implication. The State Department gets involved when there's foreign treaties involved. I don't know why the Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has anything to say, but they apparently have something to say too. The EPA for launch sites, I mean, that makes sense. Potentially there could be damage because of that. And the current thing holding up Starship is Fish and Wildlife. They're worried about the water deluge system. Apparently too much pure water is a concern, and they still are waiting for approval from that. So that's just kind of an indication of where the problems are here. Things are getting so bad, there's been a congressional hearing back in October where 3 of the companies, SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactic, and a couple of outside experts testified at a congressional hearing. And FAA in particular was kind of singled out. They had recently supposedly streamlined their procedures, but apparently they've actually made them worse. They're saying licensing takes longer than the rocket development, stifling innovation, and everybody's saying, FAA, please staff up. We need more staff. You need a streamlined process, and you simply need more people to do the job because there's a lot more work to do. FAA actually is refusing. They're kind of sore because they felt they're not getting enough for their existing job for managing aviation in normal airspace. And so they're saying, no, we're not going to do it. What they just said recently, just the last couple of days, is maybe if you guys gave us some money, we could do it. Now, that's not completely crazy because they do extract fees from the aviation industry. But what they pretty much said was, people are complaining, and yet I'm not even doing the job that I'm supposed to be doing with airplanes. And at least they give me some money. So obviously there's ongoing resolution that has to be worked on here. What these people are saying is, you kind of need a single hub for authorizing commercial space activity. And FAA might not be the right place for that. They're saying we risk losing the lead in spaceflight. And it's not just China. There's places that just don't do so much regulation. Luxembourg, you probably never think of Luxembourg as being a space power. Actually, they've got like 50 space companies there. They have the equivalent of NASA, except what they do is they just promote business of space and nothing else. And as a result, they have companies like SES, the people that do a lot of communication satellites. Despite the dysfunction with FAA, actually there are people saying we should have FAA control everything in space. This would be manufacturing, mining, space hotels, satellite servicing, solar power satellites, commercial missions to Mars, Venus, or asteroids, structures on the moon. Can you imagine the FAA being put in the position of issuing building permits for a lab on the moon? The whole idea is so nuts. It's so far outside of their expertise. NSS actually has, the National Space Society has taken a stand on this. They're proposing the approvals belong in the Department of Commerce because at least there's somebody who wants to see the United States and others succeed in space. Because that's kind of a problem. There's no government agency that sees space development as their major role. NASA actually doesn't. They see it as science, first of all. And then for the manned missions, kind of their main priority, they're still thinking of the old days 50 years ago of prestige. You know, we're going to do flags and footprints. We're going to send people out for 5 days to land on the moon or Mars. That's still a lot of the thinking there. They actually have said that they don't believe it's their responsibility to do that much space development. Now, the reality is NASA is doing a lot of stuff that is aiding in that, mostly the science behind a lot of what has to get done. And there are a lot of individuals and small groups that are working toward that. But for the agency as a whole, it's not really their place. And they're not really regulators anyway. That's not really an appropriate role for them. But somebody needs to be in that position. I guess that's pretty much it.
Other space-related videos or slide presentations by me are available at the link shown here. That includes a web page and also a list of videos at my YouTube channel, so you can view them or subscribe for notifications about future videos. These presentations are mostly made as part of the meetings of National Space Society's North Houston chapter, and the link to that is shown. Topics like these are presented as part of a monthly news segment, and there are also lots of other interesting speakers and open discussions. You can attend in person or online via Zoom. Come join us.